Greetings and salutations. This is Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth. And this afternoon, I've got a very interesting gentleman, good friend of mine, and well-traveled individual, a gentleman named John Harris. I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'm going to let him get into all of his background for us and everything like that. But just suffice it to say, he's, I would consider, one of the foremost experts that I personally know on the Middle East. And we're going to talk about a couple things today, but I definitely wanted to just launch the call off and have John tell us a little bit about himself and go from there. So, John, I know when we're talking on Thursday, we talked a little bit about your background and tours that you've done, but you started off originally with Christian peacemakers. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's an organization called Christian Peacemaker Teams. The purpose of the organization is to try to reduce the level of violence in small-scale conflicts. And I was active with them from 2009 to 2014. I spent parts of 5 summers in the West Bank in the Palestinian Territories of Israel. I'm also a government econ teacher at a public high school in Modesto, California. It's my 15th year teaching, and I'm single and looking.
Hear that, ladies? He's single and looking, so there's that. And he's also tall and very good looking.
6'2", 176.1.
That's great.
Good job.
So what cities were you in the West Bank and in the territories? And I don't want to ask a 2-part question. What cities were you in the West Bank?
I was in one city for my activism work. It was to most of us it's called Hebron, and to Arab speakers it's called Al Khalil.
Okay.
It is the home of the Abrahami Mosque. It's allegedly where Abraham and his 2 sons and their wives are buried. It's a holy site for 3 religions, but specifically the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith are very interested in having control over that city. It's a hotly contested piece of real estate, and it's the place of great distress and violence within the West Bank.
Let me ask you an honest question. Would you say that a large part of the conflict is religious in Hebron, or would you say it's more political and they use religion as a mask?
I would say that it's largely political, and they don't use religion as a mask as much as we might want to think.
Okay.
If this conflict ever turns religious, I think it'll be more deeply ingrained and, dig into your boots more than it is now.
Sure.
But for now, it's largely a political conflict.
Okay. What's the groundwork for that political conflict that does not involve religion? Because obviously we're talking, the Muslims and the Jews, or the Israelis and the Arabs. So would it be more accurate to say that it's between Israelis and Arabs or between Muslims and Jews?
I think it's more between Israelis and Arabs. If you look at the history of the region, it has passed different people groups controlling it for thousands of years. It is true that at twice in history before 1947, it was a Jewish state. It's also been a state of many other groups that have come and gone. The Jews were largely kicked out of that region for something I think is good. They were working for their independence against Rome, and Rome finally just said, screw it, and they kicked the Jews out. And Jews have more or less faced 2,000 years of persecution at times and partial persecution at times. Of course, we know that more recently in history, the pogroms and the Holocaust have happened.
Right.
And the Jews have been looking for a homeland in the 1880s, 1890s. They decided that homeland was going to be their ancestral homeland, what they call Israel. And at the time that they decided that ancestral homeland was going to be theirs again, it was inhabited primarily Arab people with a minority of Jews and a minority of Christians who were Arab in ethnicity. And at that time, before the Jewish movement, there was relative peace between Arabs and Jews and Christians. It was Turkish controlled under the Ottoman Empire
for like 500 years. Absolutely. And that's the thing too, is that a lot of folks don't realize that when you talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Ottoman Empire and the drafting of Arabs by the Europeans to fight the Turkish for them, literally. Most folks don't understand that a lot of Jews out of Haifa were recruited in the same manner with the same promise that if you do this for us, we'll give you Israel, like they promised a bunch of Palestinians the same territory to be a country when the borders are getting drawn. And then, as you and I both know, after the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed, they basically divvied up the Middle East and created borders out of Syria and everywhere else. The French got this country, and the Brits got this country, and we're going to install this guy, and then King Faisal got put in here, and so then it became kind of just a giant checkerboard. After 500 years of Ottoman rule, it seemed like nothing much had changed, and then in an oligarchical structure, you've got money controlling the resources and the work lives of the people there, and that's kind of what has been going on since probably about World War I, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I don't know if I would focus primarily on the money thing. I think it might be the main issue. Basically, when we look at Africa and the Middle East, we can really point the finger at the Western countries.
Sure.
Dividing up land in ways that they saw fit so that they could divide and conquer. They're going to set people free, or they're going to control people, or whatever. They did not divide up that land in good ways.
No.
And we have this tribe being partially in this country. We have that tribe being partially in that country. And the Middle East and the African countries are still suffering from that. We haven't figured out a way to move beyond the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But you know what? It's not the white people that are bad. It's that this is how it's been done throughout history. The divide and conquer technique is done by all empires.
Absolutely. No, it's
always wrong.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, for the last few hundred years, it's been European white guys, and the metrics are the metrics. It just looks like you're taking advantage of weaker and or less educated people, and also making promises that aren't going to be kept. I mean, we've been doing that as a country since we landed on Plymouth Rock. I mean, we've been promising the American Indian this, that, and the third, and on top of that, taking their land from them. And unfortunately, as you and I both know, history gets written by the winners. And so the narratives change and perspectives change, and they're made to fit regardless. I mean, you and I have talked about this before, and I'm actually, for my background, for being a kid whose dad is Palestinian, I'm actually pretty pro-Israel, and for the most part, in that I believe in the right to exist. However, the last 20, 25 years especially, they've been behaving in your typical oppressive kind of state, literally turning and turning the West Bank and Gaza into an open air prison, and not without some help from the so-called Arab leadership. I mean, we were talking the other night about Marwan Barghouti, and here's a guy who could be a leader, and even there's like a 65% poll rate that wants Mahmoud Abbas to leave. He's building a $13 million palace right now. He's got a $50 million jet while the people are suffering and not able to go to work because of the strikes and the border closings and everything else.
Sounds like our president, huh? Awesome.
Doesn't that sound amazing? That's probably what he thought when he saw that. Hey, I can golf. I can get a plane.
Totally, man.
Bibi Netanyahu doesn't even have a plane, so that should tell you something. But the Israelis have single-payer health care, so there is that. But that's the thing is the leadership benefits from the chaos, in my opinion. Yasser Arafat died with $1 billion in his pocket, and that's good nonprofit work if you can get it, right? And yet the people struggle and they suffer, and they're the ones who suffer from the strikes, and they're the ones who suffer from the work closings and not being able to go into Israel to work. And for all the years and all the monies that have been poured into the territories, they've not created an infrastructure of really any note. I mean, you've been there more recently than I have. Is that something that is accurate, or am I off base on that?
Yeah, you're pretty accurate. I think what's happening is that we need an international movement here. Everyone benefits if countries are at peace.
Yep.
It's good across the board.
Yep.
And because of the significance of the Middle East and oil, because of the significance of the emergence of Israel since 1948 as a Western democratic state within the Middle East, I I hope we can solve this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
We won't be able to solve this conflict unless we hold all sides accountable.
Right.
And generally speaking, the powerful side is the hardest side to hold accountable.
Sure.
And that side, which is Israel, is, number one, a very nice country with very good people. And they're Western and they're democratic. It's like Europe in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
If we want to appease them, we really have to break it down and say, we recognize Israel as a state. We recognize Israel as a Jewish state.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I agree or disagree with it being a Jewish state. I just know it's something that they need to create peace.
Sure.
But what's happening there is, when I was in Christian peacemaker teams, what I saw was a slow purging of Arab power. They control the Arab region in Israel. They call it the Palestinian Territories. Reasonably, it can be called Palestine. It was a nickname that the Romans gave the area 2,000 years ago. The nickname kind of stuck.
Right. No, I used to tease my dad about that all the time. I go, you didn't even make up your own name. The Italians gave it to you. And he's like, oh, shut up.
Hey, God bless the Italians. They brought us pizza and spaghetti.
That's right. There you go. And Marco Polo.
But this is a Western democratic country we're talking about. And I used to live there in the summers. I also used to live in the Republic of South Africa. I watched the country change. I also spent about 4 weeks in Ireland, 3 of that in Northern Ireland, hanging out with Protestant and Catholic paramilitary forces and volunteering to be a camp counselor for a racial reconciliation center. The races, of course, are the Protestants and the Catholics. They look alike, they sound alike, they tie their shoes the same, but they were at the time warring factions. So I have seen conflicts similar to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict end in peace, both in South Africa and in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
God bless them. So if it's possible there, it's possible in Israel. Unfortunately, Israel's aggression against the Palestinians is unchecked. I've watched them take people's pipes for their farms and just put them in the back of a dump truck. I've watched them seize nonprofits. I've watched them kick people out of their homes. I have watched soldiers go into the home next to me and thrash it. I have watched soldiers take, the 17-year-old boys that hung out in the barber shop around the corner from my apartment and just keep them against the wall for 45 minutes. These small atrocities of the Israeli government through the Israeli military against the Arab people are what are fueling the Arabs to continue their fight for independence. And that's what people might not recognize. It's not a one-sided state where the Arabs are bad and the Israelis are good.
No.
It's both, but the Israelis are more powerful, and therefore, naturally, they're more of the aggressor in this situation. So what we need to have happen is something like what we did in South Africa.
Sanctions.
We need to mess with them.
Yeah.
We need to say, you can't fly over our land. You can't come to our sporting events. We're going to stop trade with you. And it's got to bug them so much that eventually they'll be forced into making a peace agreement with the Palestinians.
Well, that was
an economic boycott of Israel, a land that I love and support. As an ally and a Western democratic nation.
But see, you're not far off, though, because the only time in my lifetime that and my limited knowledge of the area, I'm probably better than most. I mean, not as good as yours, I don't think. But the only time I saw anything like that work was when James Baker dragged Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat by the ear right when the wall fell in Russia, the timing was amazing. It's like, hey, look, Russia doesn't have any more money right now. They aren't going to help you. So Arafat had to come to the table, and he basically told the Israelis, you build one more settlement, and we're going to cut you off. So you got to come to the table. And and surprise, surprise, they went to Oslo, and it wasn't perfect, but at least there was an airport in Gaza, right? My old man actually flew in to Gaza City and went to where his folks are in Ramallah, just outside of Ramallah. And he came back all ecstatic. He goes, you're not going to believe it. Man, there was an airport in Gaza. It's like Burbank Airport. It's really nice. And about 10 years later, it got completely decimated because, Ariel Sharon decided to get up on the dome of the mosque or the Temple Mount, whichever you want to call it, and declare this land, Jewish land forever, and doodah, and basically just spit on the grave of Yitzhak Rabin and make sure that, this wasn't going to happen, thus beginning the second Intifada. And so when, and this is the thing, and you touched on something a second ago, and I want to kind of, make this point. Guys like you and me, unfortunately, will see that, and not in a conciliatory, Donald Trump, Charlottesville, oh, there's good people on both sides. Now, they're neo-Nazis, you fucking asshole. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, you see what the Israelis are doing. You see what some of the Palestinian leadership, I would say more than the people, the civilians suffer in these aggressive acts, and it makes me sad because I wish they would just go after the leadership. I wish they would go after Mahmoud Abbas. I wish they would go after Hamas in a more aggressive way, or Hezbollah. They go after the people, without warrant, without investigation. In a lot of cases, some of these things that you told me you saw, I would lay you dollars to donuts. There wasn't a formal investigation or any sort of a warrant, right? It was maybe a collaborator ratted these people out. Is that kind of about right?
Yeah, but I don't want to focus on that because all those things that we're talking about are things that are going to happen in a small-scale war.
Sure. Okay.
It's natural.
Sure.
The idea, the solution is, okay, how do we end the small-scale war?
Okay.
It's not going to be nitpicking at who's doing what to whom, but those things are important. But how are we going to force Israel to really go to the bargaining table and lose some of their interests and have the Palestinian Arabs lose some of their interests and come to a peace agreement? And what that peace agreement is not up to me. It's not up to the United States or the United Nations. It's up to them. What are they going to do?
That's right. And I agree with you 100% on that. And that's the other thing, too. When you look at concessions, for example, and it has been very aggressive, especially in the last 30 years, where the settlements encroaching on the West Bank alone, you've got Israeli settlements, comprising of about 40% of the population of the West Bank, which is close to about 2 million people, roughly the size of Austin, where I'm recording from right now. And so, for instance, the nation of Israel has about 20% of their population being Arab. And so, okay, well, let's just split the difference and call it a wash. You guys already have the settlements in there. Start working out some deals where, the most recent refugees can get their land back, because those are all land grabs, not unlike what we did in the United States. That's the other part that, when you look at, they say, Israel has to go back to pre-1967 borders. Could you imagine if someone in Europe, told a president in 1852 to go to pre-1812 borders, but go fuck yourself. We got Manifest Destiny and the King James Bible. And we just kept going, right? And so for us to expect Israel to give back land they won, the other side of that argument is I've never seen a country start non-violently. It's never started with a handshake. Pakistan was a bloody mess when it got started the very same year, by the way, and no one questions their legitimacy. They've killed prime ministers, a bunch of them, and they've killed people that try to run for prime minister, a bunch of them. And as far as a stable ally, they've got nukes because of us. They got nukes because they allowed us to truck Russian-captured weapons by Israel through Egypt into Pakistan and make it look like the Muslims are supplying the Afghans and not us. So, and for that benefit, we allowed Pakistan to develop nuclear weapons. And so it's always this. Earlier, you made a good comment that I really want to zero in on is, when you said it's not about good guys or bad guys, that narrative is a false narrative. But we pitch that narrative on every angle, and it's just screaming into the wind of American exceptionalism. We're the good guys. We always do the right thing. We always back the right horse. No, we don't. And we've overthrown or colluded in, or whatever you want to call it, interfered with over 80 elections in the last 70 years since the advent of the CIA. We've deposed,
including the elections in Russia.
Absolutely. Yeltsin didn't get in on accident, and so. So there's that whole narrative, and we can touch on that in a second. But all that to say that we are so not pure, and we win. How American is this? This is almost like the formation of the Mormon religion. Jesus came to Missouri. Why? Well, it was in America. It's okay, awesome. We invaded a country. We invaded Panama, arrested a sitting leader, tried him in a Miami court, and put him in jail in America.
Well, good. He was a drug dealer.
Yeah, and he was our drug dealer until he wasn't.
No, you know what, Abe? I wanna challenge that thinking. We have allies. It doesn't matter what the country does. If they're our ally, that's good. That's how it works on the international level. But you know what? People change. And the dictator in that country changed. He was turning his country into a narco state. We stepped in and stopped it. It was in our interest. It was in the interest of the Panamanian people. God bless the U.S. military and the U.S. government.
We killed 6,000. We invaded a country of 2 million people. We killed 6,000 civilians on a president that we installed knowing full well who he was. We killed Torrijos. He was assassinated. And then we installed Manuel Noriega. Installed him. Like we installed Chile's Pinochet after Allende. Because Allende was not playing ball with Anaconda Copper. And we installed Pinochet, and we let him run rampant for 27 years until he died of old age. So who are we to dictate?
Not everything that the United States does is bad. In fact, I think most of it is good. I support the taking out of Manuel Noriega. I don't support what we did in, some of the South American countries. But,
El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, Ecuador.
There's a lot of bad. There's a lot
Peru,
of good.
Chile,
But,
Argentina.
I would like to go back to Hebron.
Okay.
For our listeners, I'd like to kind of paint a picture of Hebron.
Okay.
So imagine a city, an Arab city of 250,000. It happens to be the business capital of the Palestinian state.
Okay.
And within a half mile of the Abrahami Mosque, there are 4 Jewish settlements of about 100 people each.
Okay.
Now, it's not like there's an Israeli settlement on top of a hilltop in farmland out in the territory somewhere.
Right.
It's that in Hebron, the 4 Israeli settlements are apartment complexes completely surrounded by an urban Palestinian neighborhood.
Okay.
It would be similar to this. It's 1965. It's Watts, California, and the Ku Klux Klan gets a hold of an apartment complex, and they live in the middle of a black area. Now, it gets worse because in Hebron, this has happened.
Sure.
And what does the Israeli government do about it? Well, according to their constitution, they must support Israeli citizens wherever they live.
Right.
So you have the Israeli military having a huge presence in Hebron, and they protect these 400 settlers against the Arabs that surround them. And they do a very good job. They stop violence against the Israeli settlers. What they don't do is they don't stop the violence of the Israeli settlers on the Arab population.
Right. Okay.
In fact, it goes beyond that. And as I have stated earlier, I have watched at least 100 times incidences of the Israeli military itself persecuting Palestinian citizens in Hebron. It's a nightmare.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
I saw some stuff. I was there way before you went, and when it was still tame compared to some of the stories you told me. And I saw some stuff in Jerusalem that was unbelievable to watch, that I was seeing it live. I was like 23, it was a weird time because, you think you're a guy and a man and you've had a few fist fights, and then you see soldiers doing something that you think is wrong, and you're kind of going, but they got guns. I got a passport, which is like, oh, he shot him. Oh, he's an American. Oh, well, and I would, so it just, but yeah, man, no, it's, but this is the thing. You make a good point, because I remember one of the stories one summer you got back, and I think it was in Hebron, where your job that summer, or your one of your duties that summer, was walking kids to school and back to ensure that they wouldn't get attacked by settlers. Did I misunderstand that, or was that right?
No, that's correct. We walk students to school. We inspect checkpoints to make sure that the soldiers are letting people through the checkpoints, specifically children going to school. And what happens is that they oppress people randomly.
Sure.
It's basic common sense. If you want to control a population, you don't announce what you're going to do. You don't do the same thing every day.
Right.
You randomly shut down the checkpoints.
Right.
So when they shut down the checkpoints, what do? We get out our weapons, which is cameras, phones, video recorders, and we'll also call the Israeli military, we'll call the Israeli government, and we'll complain. So we go to the source. We have a relationship with Israel. We have a relationship with the Palestinian Authority.
You mean the peacemakers?
Yes, our organization.
Okay.
Yeah. We got our phones, and we start making phone calls, and we start videotaping. And eventually, because of our group's presence and a couple other international groups' presence, that random act of indecency will stop.
Okay.
But then it might happen again in another 14, 20 days.
Right.
And it's just that the people are upset.
And they're sick of it.
In that area that is so densely controlled and oppressed like this, your middle class has moved out.
Yeah, they do.
And your lower classes, your working poor, have moved in. And the only people left in the neighborhood are the working poor and your activist-minded Arabs who are going to stay here out of, this is our land, this is our neighborhood. We're not going to let the Israelis overrun us.
Right.
It's really just a nightmare.
Well, see, and to your point, this is the progressive narrative in America anyway. Again, if you're buying into good guys, bad guys, anytime you got the military against an unarmed civilian population, it's never good. And there's always a reason to be angry and upset and demanding change, especially, the conditions in the West Bank and Gaza it's an open-air prison. If it is flat out an open-air prison. And I remember when there was a university in Ramallah, I had cousins come off the boat, and they all spoke English. It was that stiff kind of, how do you do English, right? But they at least knew English because they got an hour a day in school. And if they didn't go to university in Ramallah, they had enough out of their primary education to get into a college, say in Europe or wherever. And by the time they came to the States, their English, like I said, it was kind of formal. But then in about a year and a half, they'd be saying dude and man, and their diction changed a little bit, and they got more American. I got a cousin. I'm 54. My cousin's 62 years old. He says things like nice. He does that all the time. I remember when he was like 20 and he came here. He's like, how do you do? Now he's like, nice, and everything's like nice, and you're like, oh, good for you, man. But
hey, you don't look a day over 53.
It's that age between 53 and 54, as Bill Burr says. I'm in that weird age that I look like a young lizard right now, or a Shrek. But to your point though, the last 20, 25 years you've seen, and that is a long time to not have schools functioning. You're getting in a near pre-Lutheran illiteracy rate out there, where you've got 60-65% of young men who don't really read. And that might be too high of a number. I might be misquoting that, but I've read different studies, and I know schools, most of the schools have been closed, 10, 15, 20 years. And that's a long time to not have schools. That's a couple of generations to not have schools. There's
a lot of schools functioning out there.
Okay.
There's even an evangelical Christian seminary in Bethlehem that I've had a lot of my tours stay at, and I've stayed at and have good relationships with them. Okay,
so what are the areas that are most affected by, say, for example, a lack of education? Am I overstating that?
What the areas in, I don't know a lot about Gaza. I've never been there. But in the West Bank, the areas that are hurting the most in education are the refugee camps.
Right.
I don't know the history behind that, but I've seen the statistics. I've been to a couple of the refugee camps, and the Palestinian school system there is greatly lacking when compared to the Palestinian school system outside the refugee camps.
And this kind of gets back to the point I was going to make a minute ago, and I got on a tangent, so I apologize. But the point I was making was the progressive or the slash, I don't like the word liberal anymore just because it doesn't really mean anything anymore, but the progressive left at least that are paying attention to the Middle East, paying attention to Israel and the Palestinian situation, that narrative is always a good guy, bad guy narrative, zeroing in on the military against the civilians, and no one really talks about the corruption of the Palestinian leadership. And that is where the people are suffering, because if the leadership refuses to come to the table with the Israelis, they're never going to make a deal. And if they don't make a deal, they're fine, because their IMF money or whatever they're getting money, the Iranians' money, still keeps coming in. And that's why Mahmoud Abbas can build a $13 million palace, and that's why he can get a $50 million jet or whatever, a Boeing 700. And so all of that to say, don't you think in this country, because I know in Europe, you read The Guardian, you read The Intercept, and obviously Al Jazeera is going to have a little bit of a slant, but they still pretty much are pretty pro-Israel for an Arab network. How is it that we keep ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the failure of the Palestinian leadership to really affect a change and move forward? It's been 70 years. It's not going to be simple, but it's not impossible. Would you agree with that, or is that am I?
No, I think I would hold the opposite understanding. I read Al Jazeera every day, which is an Arab-based news network.
Right.
I read Haaretz every day, which is
Israeli.
a liberal Israeli daily.
Mm-hmm.
I read other sources. I talk to people. I've been there. And in my estimation, the Palestinian leadership fairly approaches the negotiation process.
I know that. Wait, barely or fairly? I'm sorry.
Fairly. I think they're doing very good in what they're doing in the negotiation process. I don't think it's corrupt. Of course, any third world government that has a small scale war and is occupied is probably going to have some corruption in the government. That's part of the situation, unfortunately. So it's very stereotypical. But when they come to the table and they say, we're not going to negotiate while you're building settlements, you know what? That's one option that I think is fair.
Absolutely.
We can look at other options that they're not doing, and we can say, oh, they should do this instead of that. Well, you know what? It's their struggle, and for them to say we're not going to negotiate while you're building settlements, I don't say that's a negative to them. Okay.
Here's the thing, and this is where I will say it's a negative to them. You're right if that's the whole story, and I agree with you 100% if that's the whole story. But the other part of the story is, for instance, in the 2014 war, that summer, when Hamas and Hezbollah launched about 7,000 rockets into Israel. And if it wasn't for, and this is cracks me up about the Republicans and their problem with Obama. I'm like, okay, you do realize he was the Black Reagan, right? You do realize W would not pay for Iron Dome, but Obama paid for Iron Dome, right? Yeah. 100 Israelis got killed, about 2,000 Arabs got killed, despite the fact that they had 7,000 rockets. They're taking monies and equipment and supplies that were given to them to, say, for example, build hospitals and schools and build tunnels to tunnel into Israel and kill Jews. So it's not as though if it was one-sided and the PA, for example, which is completely toothless at this point, but let's just say the PA, who still recognizes the mainstream negotiator in some respects. I know Hamas is starting to come around a little bit in term. They're kind of becoming the Sinn Féin, if you will. But
hey, that's a good analysis. I like that.
Oh, thank you very much. I try. I'm here all week. Try the Mugu Gai Pan. But so the PA come into the table with just, hey, don't if nothing else was going on and they said, hey, you can't build any more settlements, and the Israelis kept building the settlements, then they would say, okay, the Israelis are a bunch of fuckers. But if the Israelis are going, yeah, okay, we'll stop building the settlements if you quit trying to kill us. And the PA is so toothless, they can't control Hezbollah or Hamas, and Hezbollah and Hamas has no intention. Because where there's chaos, there's funds. And where there's funds, the hoi polloi get the private jets and the Pierre Cardin suits and go bang hookers in Sweden on a weekend. And meanwhile, the people suffer.
Let me respond to some of those things.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I want to make a clear distinction between the Palestinian Authority, which is a political coalition who's in charge of the Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank, and the other group, Hamas, which is in control of the Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip.
Right.
Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine.
Yes.
And the Muslim Brotherhood is an international organization. It's founded in Egypt in the 1920s or something like that.
Right, right.
But notice, Abe, that the function and structure of the Muslim Brotherhood in Tunisia is different from the Muslim Brotherhood structure and function in Egypt, and is different from the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine.
Okay.
Notice that when the Muslim Brotherhood were the ruling party in Israel, that they were pulling their hair out about Hamas in Palestine. Hamas in Palestine figured, hey, we're Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood just won the elections in Egypt. It's going to be great. They're going to open up the border. It's going to be awesome. They're going to give us weapons. We're going to mess with the Israelis. No. What the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did is they tried to hold the Muslim Brotherhood, a.k.a. Hamas in Palestine, at arm's length.
Right.
The Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine is a reactionary political force that wants to build bombs in their garages and fire them at Israel, and they almost never kill anybody, but instead they get retaliation from Israel where thousands of them die. And you know what? Good for Israel. You're going to bomb me, I'm going to bomb you.
That's exactly what I believe. Yeah, I agree with you.
But what's more important in all this is not the structure and function of Hamas. It's not whether the PLO is doing a good job in negotiations or to what extent they are corrupt. It's not how bad the Israeli government is becoming on the issue. It's that we need a solution, and it looks to me like the only solution is going to be an international movement against Israel, led by the United States, sanctions. Until sanctions happen, these kind of things are going to happen because it's a small-scale war. Unfortunately, the United States is not prepared to do that.
No, they're not.
And, first of all, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, let me make some statements before I tell you why.
Sure, go ahead.
I love Jews. I love Jewish Americans. I love Israel. I love Israeli Jews. Israel is a great country. It's Western. It's democratic. The people are good. The people are fun. I love spending my weekends in Israel, leaving behind the Palestinian conflict and just going to Israel and hanging out and learning what it's like to be an Israeli.
Gee, you mean hot Jewish girls in thong bikinis in Tel Aviv versus girls in Amman? I couldn't imagine why.
You would not believe.
I got a lot of Israeli friends in LA. I do believe.
Yes, I am a single heterosexual male, and Jewish women are incredibly attractive.
Yes, they are.
As Israel is my friend, as Israel is my ally, I will also put sanctions on Israel to force them into better behavior at the bargaining table.
Sure.
I wish that there was an international movement of sanctions against the United States during our civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968. I think it would have been justified.
100%.
You're not killing people. You're just crippling the economy a little bit and causing them to squirm in their seats.
Right.
It's not bad. The Israeli government will say, oh no, if you do that, you're racist. No, I don't care what your race is. I care that the whole world will profit if this conflict comes to an end, and if I have to stop trading with you and letting you at my sporting events to do it, then yeah, I'm ready to do it. I'm going to punish my friend. I'm going to give a kid that I love a detention.
But see, that's what James Baker did, and it didn't last long. I mean, he barely squeezed, and both sides came to the table.
Yeah.
And the challenge we have here is between the IMF and the Iranians and possibly the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, when it starts to get on into Asia and Central Asia, where money comes from, it gets super murky. And then you also have a couple of countries with oil that got knocked over and are run by guerrilla groups selling oil on the black market to the cartels, to the Chinese, to pretty much anybody with money. And that money gets funneled in as well. And so, again, who suffers? Not the leadership. It's not them who suffer. It's the civilians and the soldiers. Because I've been there. You've been there. It can't be a good gig to beat a boy who's 12 for not taking off his shoes during an inspection. Yeah. You can't go home feeling good about that. And they're human beings at the end of the day. Everyone's a human being at the end of the day. We train them. There's a brilliant booklet. It's a booklet. Unfortunately, it should be a book, but it was a booklet written by a guy named Smedley D. Butler. I'm sure you're familiar with War is a Racket. And that's only a 58-page book. Came out in 1938, written by a retired lieutenant major general, at the time the highest decorated Marine in the history of the Marines. Served about 30 years in the Corps. And it's just a very insane manifesto against war with profit and loss statements, which were all profit, of all the companies between 1911 and 1914, and then when the war started in World War I, for example, and some of these profits shot up 1,000%, 2,000%. War is profitable. And then he gets into the philosophy. What do? We motivate our troops with a flag, or during the first Gulf War, when we bombed Iraq rather for invading Kuwait, we were making up all these stories about babies being thrown out of incubators and all of that, and that had been debunked. It turned out that the only eyewitness was the ambassador to Kuwait and his daughter, who remain unidentified. Well, because he's the ambassador. Yeah, you know that story very well. And you know what? Here's what's really sad. You know that story very well. I know that story very well. What you and I are talking about is like secondhand to us, because you and I do this over a beer. Most people don't know what we're talking about. And they buy the narrative of good guy, bad guy at 100%. And that's the thing that really bothers me when you're trying to get this kind of support. For example, like what you just said earlier, if we did when we did economic sanctions against South Africa, nobody screamed anything. Most Israelis are white. So what kind of racism? Because we're anti-Semitic? We're not, just because we're instituting a corrective measure doesn't mean it's anti-Semitic. It means the world has had enough.
Yeah, we weren't anti-white when we were messing with South Africa. We're not anti-Jew if we mess with Israel.
Absolutely.
But I would like to propose a step forward to my idea of sanctions. May I?
Go ahead. I do. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, here's what's happening in the United States. We're a multicultural society. Among us are a certain percentage of Jews, and they're great citizens. Joe Lieberman is someone that I love and respect as a human and a politician. I disagree with some of his policies. I agree with others. But the Jewish Americans set American policy towards Israel in the same way that Cuban Americans set American policy towards Cuba. Here's how it works. The two political parties want people to vote for their party. So they go and they try to recruit votes from Cuban Americans and Jewish Americans. Therefore, both political parties set their agenda towards Cuba and Israel based on the primary will of those two groups in America. Mm-hmm. The problem here is that Jewish Americans aren't pro-sanctions. My challenge to Jewish Americans is that I think you need to take a different look at Israel. I think you need to do some of your own private research. I think that millions of Jewish Americans ought to take a tour of the war. I think you need to spend a week in Israel and a week in the Palestinian Territories. I want you to talk to regular citizens. I want you to talk to human rights groups on both sides. I want you to talk to the military on both sides. I want you to become educated in this issue more than you currently are. And, I don't fault Jewish Americans for not being fully educated. I mean, how many Americans are fully educated on any issue? It's just, we're just citizens. We're not experts. But when Jewish Americans believe that we ought to mess with the Israeli government more than we are now, then the political parties will be able to.
Right.
So what's holding back adequate negotiations are Jewish Americans.
See, but
so
this
there's
is
my challenge.
Okay, but here's the thing, and I agree with you, but I'll answer to that in that, and this is the challenge with leadership in general, not just America.
Mm-hmm.
James Baker and George Bush didn't take a survey; they just did it. And so it's up to a statesman versus a politician. And for me to say James Baker's a statesman, frame that Kodak moment. He kind of falls into the category of even a stop clock tells the time right twice a day. But that being said, because he did something right. So I got to give it to him. Heavy props. But the thing is, the job of a statesman versus a politician placates, but a statesman is to educate. Martin Luther King educated. He didn't take a survey. And he also was a lot more radical than the "I Have a Dream" speech. We just had the 50th anniversary, and you know what I'm going to say because I know you know this. But it's not a secret. I mean, it doesn't cost the government any money to integrate a lunch counter. But as soon as he started talking about getting rid of the war in Vietnam, getting out of the war in Vietnam, and jobs programs and the Poor People's Campaign, it's kind of interesting how the FBI relieved him of his duty, his detail. He had no detail. And when Johnson told him that, it was like they both knew it was a death sentence. And, a couple months back in Esquire, they reprinted an old essay that James Baldwin wrote. It's a brilliant essay on his entire journey pretty much until the funeral that Baldwin had attended. And it points that out, that it was like mid-1967, late 1967, when Johnson had called Martin Luther King into his office and said, "We're relieving you of your security detail from the FBI," and they both knew it was a death sentence. And the mainstream supposed liberal press at that time had washed their hands of him. They weren't covering him as much because he became the anti-Vietnam guy, the pro-poor guy, and that's going to cost money. And that's a whole nother country as opposed to integrating a lunch counter or a school bus, which costs nothing. And so, but a leader does what he did at great risk. You expend political capital. When people tell me they miss Bush or they miss Obama, I'm like, what political capital did those guys expend to get anything done? They didn't take their cases before the Congress in a lot of places. They just signed executive orders. And between the two of them and Bill Clinton, and if you go back to Reagan even and before, but let's just stop at Reagan. The explosion of the surveillance state, gutting the unions, gutting welfare, privatizing prisons. We now have almost 4 million prisoners. We had only 300,000 people in federal prisons in 1980, and and it's just become a sort of a homemade Nicaragua, if you will. We've got these guys, we're busting them on bullshit drug laws, putting them in prison, making them work for free. So where does the leadership show up to educate that and push that, run around the country like their hair's on fire to talk about that? I mean, if people are afraid that if the parties are, and this is all they are now, one big right wing, and you got the crazy right who believe in a 6,000-year-old cartoon and they hate guns or they love guns and hate gay people, and then you've got the other part of the right, they like gay people and abortions, and that's kind of about the only difference. They take the money from the same places. They'll never stand up to any of the industries. We're getting ready to mine lithium in Afghanistan to hopefully pay for the war, supposedly, because the opium wasn't enough. And we got an opium crisis now for a decade plus. How did that happen? Oh, I don't know. Maybe because the cheapest opium on earth is available for free in Afghanistan since we invaded it. So, but nobody wants to do that anymore. No one wants to be the first guy through the door and get shot. And so the challenge I've got with some of what you said is it is up to the leadership. And I agree with you. I agree with you 100% that the Israeli lobby here is very strong. And unless they come to the table and play ball, there is going to be a problem. It will never happen. But we did it once before. It can happen. And it has to happen from leadership and not waiting. This is the thing people always kind of forget. Like I saw some stupid meme on Twitter. Some guy said, women got the right to vote and blacks were integrated. White people did that. I'm like, oh, really? Okay, I've never seen a right given in this country. Everything's been demanded. Everything.
Of course, that's how power works.
That's right.
Power is never given up.
It's never given up. You have to go get it. And from Stonewall to Harvey Milk to Martin Luther King to suffrage to Susan B. Anthony, all that stuff. It was somebody going, hey, this is bullshit, and we're going to fix it. The Constitution is great.
The Dodgers beating the Yankees in the World Series.
Well, yeah, and that's awesome. But last year wasn't. But here's on a side note with that, if the Dodgers didn't make it to 30 years, we were going to have to invent a curse. Because you have to. When something's 30 years old, well, in 87, they pantsed Oral Hershiser and they beat him up because he was a Mormon, man. So it's the Mormon curse, man. Joseph Smith cursed him. Something had to happen because 30 years is a long stretch to not appear at the World Series. But all that to say that, in all seriousness, and we're kind of running tight on time, and I wanted to touch on some of the things, but this has been great. But it is up to leadership to educate us and tell us why. If you want to get peace in the Middle East, what do we have to do? And it's not Donald Trump unilaterally declaring that we're going to make Jerusalem the capital, which is a grease fire in and of itself. And there's a reason why, I don't know if he read anything ever, but there's a reason why every embassy is in Tel Aviv. There's a lot of stuff that is written down, pending a negotiation, pending a satisfactory negotiation, which is what Oslo was about. And, people just kind of like, okay. I'm like, wow. That's kind of
again, Abe. That's all things that are symptomatic of a small-scale war. I'd like to suggest a step forward for the Jewish American community.
Okay.
I'd like to suggest a website and an organization that my Jewish American friends might consider. It's called J Street. You can find it on the web at jstreet.org. They are what, in my personal opinion, they are evolving into what I think is a more reasonable Jewish American response to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. They're more willing to look at forcing Israel to do things that Israel is not willing to do yet. So, you too, take a look at it.
I will. And what I'll do is when this broadcast posts, I will put that link. I'll make that link available so our listeners can actually, take a look at that for themselves as well. So it's J as the letter J as in Jewish, street.org.
Right.
Excellent.
And just, again, I'd like to put out this idea that you can love Jews, you can love Israel, you can declare Israel a Jewish state, and you can be against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at the same time. Because you disagree with that country's policies in the occupied territories does not mean you are against Israel or Jews. Because I know hundreds of Jewish Israelis who are activists within Israel against the occupation.
Absolutely. Well, this is and you make an excellent point, because this is the thing that drives me crazy in this country. Again, the good guy, bad guy narrative.
Including religious Jews.
Well, and this is the thing. Again, the good guy, bad guy narrative. That is, and everyone uses it, not just us. But that is what is so damaging, because what you said is 100% correct. You're a teacher. You get a kid to serve detention. It's not because you hate the kid or hate his family. He did something wrong. And so we got to correct it. And we have a lot of allies that we could do that with. And some we do and some we don't. And especially a lot of our banana republic dictators, we don't. The Saudis, they're creating a genocide in Yemen right now. No problem. We look the other way on that one. But why not? Why not get them to come to the table? Enough's enough. How many more kids got to die? How many more families have to watch their relatives be slaughtered? How many more incentives do we give the Hezbollahs and the Hamases of the world to walk into a mosque and pull out 20 guys and execute them in front of their families for suspecting them of being collaborators? That climate is a symptom, as you said, of this entire bigger problem. Man, listen, we're out of time. We're coming up on the hour. I really do appreciate you visiting with us, John. And I'm going to put jstreet.org at the bottom of the broadcast here as soon as we air it. And again, folks, if this makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. So sleep tight.